the Forged and Unbroken podcast.
Well, if you would do us the honor, you have like a pretty neat background from what I gather, just from online. So if you don't mind, just kind of bringing us up to speed on who you are and your background and your interest in where you're teaching now.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is, as you say, it's a bit all over the place. So I studied psychology and neuroscience in grad school. I started out looking at just like social behaviors, like pro-social behaviors and psychopathy and aggression. And then I started to focus more on sort of the environmental determinants of some of these social behaviors. So I did a lot of research in my PhD at University of Chicago, looking at how nature is psychologically beneficial to us, focusing on how spending time in nature affects our mood, it improves our cognition, it even affects our brain activity. And so I did a lot of work in that space. And then sort of over time, in the context of climate change, it really felt like what we knew about how heat affects us psychologically was comparatively poorly understood to, one, how we know nature, for example, affects us psychologically, but also how heat affects us physiologically. Like we have a really good understanding of how heat impacts the body. And there was just a lot less research on how heat impacts the mind and behavior. So that's when I sort of started getting into that research. And after finishing my PhD at UChicago, I did a postdoctoral fellowship there, and now I am at Washington State University. I have my own lab, which is pretty cool, and we do focus primarily on how heat affects us psychologically.
Okay, that's amazing. And I actually, right before we jumped on, I had just picked up on the nature exposure part of your background, which I hadn't realized before, and I'm super stoked right now because that's like a whole other arm of like mental health that certainly interests me as well. So I would love to dig in on that if we have the time as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's amazing. So if you bear with me, I'm going to start with like a little bit of a story, so to speak. There is one area where I used to volunteer just outside the nation's capital, and it's one of the busiest fire departments in the nation. And I remember when I first started about 20 years ago there, some of the senior firefighters of the area would talk about how the summertime was some of the busiest. And generally in the fire service, the fire season for residential and structure fires are more so the winter because of overloaded electrical systems and candles and heating systems and things like that.
Sure.
But it was flipped for this area, and I think a lot of areas where the summer was a little bit busier, and a lot of it they would go back to it being a socioeconomically depressed area, and then there's drug and alcohol issues that are definitely higher probably than the national norm, and they noticed that tempers flared, and so shootings would go up, stabbings would go up, fires would go up, and it was just a really interesting place. And so it just dawned on me that you fast forward now 20 years, what firefighters of decades and generations ago experienced and knew, but didn't really maybe have data to supply that. And then when I came across your research kind of talking about this heat island effect, and that's just one piece of it, I was like, oh, this is like research now kind of backing what just some firemen knew just innately from just experience. So I thought it was so neat how that lined up. So I'm just going to let you go. Like you have data and research on this. And if you don't mind talking about like that, the research that you conducted at Chicago with all of that, if you could break it down, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so there's like a few things. Like first off is like this idea of crime, and in particular like violent crime increasing in summertime. It's been something that researchers have been interested in for a while, and part of the idea was this thing called routine activities theory, which is like more people are outside, there's more social interactions, maybe some of those social interactions turn conflict, And then you're going to see more crime, in part because of more victim availability. So there is that piece of it. And that's sort of like the sociological lens as to why we might see some of these changes in behaviors in warmer weather. And then the psychological theory that goes along with this is called the temperature regression hypothesis, which is basically like heat makes us uncomfortable. It alters our moods. It increases our perception of others as being more hostile or dangerous or threatening. And the combination of kind of the psychological impacts that it has on perception and emotion, these things are going to make it more likely for people to act aggressively, particularly reactive and impulsive aggressive behaviors. And so a lot of the research I started doing when I was in Chicago was trying to get at this sort of mechanistic level, because it's hard to say, for example, when you put someone in a lab and you expose them to a lot of heat and you see, for example, that they behave impulsively or aggressively, does that mimic what we are actually experiencing in the real world, right? It's a very different context. Ideally, we would be able to say, okay, we're seeing this phenomenon at the societal level, and we can look at what is actually happening in real life. And so one way I approached this when I was in Chicago was using a technique called ecological momentary assessment. So basically smartphone surveys combined with while people were just kind of out and about in the summertime. And we also measured kind of like their typical exposures at home to heat and a variety of other factors like green space exposure, particulate matter exposure, that sort of thing. And then we measured kind of like their self-reported feelings of impulsivity and aggression. We also had them rate their kind of emotional states while they were out and about, and related that to the thermal comfort. And kind of across the two published studies that looked at this, we found basically that when people had more at-home heat stress, so heat stress in their house that was uncomfortable, they reported more impulsivity. And determining causality there is a bit of a challenge, right? It's cross-sectional. It's just like a one-time survey. We're linking what they report. Nevertheless, the effect was pretty robust. And what was also interesting is if you looked at the urban heat island effect, which is, not necessarily related to what mitigation actions they have in their house, but what is the temperature outside? We also found that was related to impulsivity, although the relationship between outdoor heat and indoor exposure was not particularly strong. And we actually found like minimal relationship between the two, which is probably in part because of the fact that a lot of people have AC, especially in Chicago. Lots of neighborhoods don't, and lots of people don't, but that like the mitigation protected a lot of people. So we found basically this association between like self-reported impulsivity and exposure to uncomfortably hot temperatures in their own home in that summer. And so that was some like pretty good evidence that like, there might be an association here. And then separately, we looked at sort of those surveys that participants were filling out while they were out and about in outdoor environments in their kind of everyday lives. And we did find that thermal discomfort, and particularly hot thermal discomfort, was associated with worse mood states. So it didn't actually need to be particularly hot even, because people vary so much in what they find comfortable and what they find uncomfortable. And so some people were like, it's like 100 degrees and humid, and they're like, I'm good. I'm not particularly uncomfortable. And then they also didn't have a negative emotional response because they were fine. But some people, it was like, 78, and they were like, I'm way too hot, and now I'm uncomfortable, and my mood is worsened because of this. So it seems like the direct temperature actually had very minimal effect. But whatever the temperature range was that led to discomfort for those participants, that then led to a worsened emotional state. So if we, zooming back out and we think about like, how does temperature in like everyday real environments affect people psychologically? It does seem that outside of this like specific lab context, which is, a weird situation, people being exposed to higher heat is leading to more self-reported impulsivity. It's leading to momentary changes in their emotional states. And both of those things are going to be tied into these sort of like, impulsive, aggressive, reactive forms of violence.
Yeah. Wow. So, with this research, like I mentioned, we have certainly seen that out in the field when we're running more EMS runs. The emergency room visits are going up. And that's something else that I started noticing when I was looking into your stuff, is that generally ER visits will go up.
Yep.
I also saw something about like work productivity in office settings goes down at a certain temperature. And so there's something there at play. And this is so interesting. Now, you talked about the impulsivity. I think some people try to rationalize that as being, well, at least for us in the fire service, we need to be able to act quickly and be able to take in a lot of really great information and make decisions from that. And like, well, to be impulsive it could be a good thing because I just need to act quickly. But I think it's when we don't have the skill set, or if we are strained and we don't realize it, that impulsive behavior can be a serious detriment. So there's all types of things happening from the prefrontal cortex and how that is going to affect our decision making. However you want to start to play this out, because there are so many different ways to take it, and I certainly I love it. So take whatever time you need. But like, what if you could explain what? And I know I lean in on the prefrontal cortex side, but if there's other things at play, please like rope whatever you can in, like what it is, what it's doing, and how it is being strained, and how that might be detrimental for us if we don't handle it appropriately.
Yeah, totally. So I might actually first start by just kind of addressing this idea of like impulsivity being potentially beneficial or harmful. And I think one thing that's worth noting in this context is that like impulsivity is actually like a multi-dimensional construct. So like one way we think about impulsivity is like acting without thinking. Now that's actually a bit different from like being well trained and acting quickly, right? Like if things can get automated. So like a fast action is not necessarily an irrational action. But beyond just like the action side of things, I mean, the sort of impulsive decision making is sort of its own thing altogether. So you don't necessarily, because you act quickly, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're engaging in impulsive decision making. So things like gambling behavior or willingness to forego like a current reward for like a long-term reward. Like both of those things are also tied in with impulsivity, but they're just a bit different from like acting without thinking. And to your point about like the prefrontal cortex, it is involved in like all of these types of impulsivity, but it also plays, I think, just a larger role in the types of like decision making and the forms of cognition that are needed to make effective decisions in heat. So if anyone doesn't know what the prefrontal cortex is, which like probably most people don't because they're not nerds like me, basically it is the frontal most part of the cortex of your brain. So your brain has subcortical structures, your brain has cortical structures, which are on the outside of the brain is the cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is this like frontal most part of the brain. And it's really important for a lot of types of cognitive processes. So things like working memory, like can you hold things in mind and manipulate them and, then report them back? Can you sustain your attention on something? Can you focus? Can you make a good decision? Can you plan ahead? It's involved in a variety of what kind of neuroscientists and psychologists sometimes lump into like higher order cognition. So complex, demanding forms of cognition. And in the context of heat, the PFC is definitely affected. The research on this, especially in humans, is actually somewhat limited. I think this is in part because of the logistical demands of inducing high heat stress and then measuring brain activity. It's not negligible. So what people often do is if they're trying to use an fMRI, which is this big magnet that you put someone into and you measure their brain activity, I've seen people kind of wear like a heat suit that induces it, or size in the heat, and then kind of maintaining that hyperthermic fever state. And then they put them in the MRI scanner and then look at changes. But I think because it's logistically really hard, there's not a ton of research out there, and that looks at brain activity specifically. And most of it has to do with hyperthermia. So like a true like change in core body temperature, which is not necessarily the level of change you're going to see in most people in everyday life, though very possibly in a firefighting situation, you might see hyperthermic effects. But what we do know from kind of the somewhat limited research that is out there is that heat seems to disrupt the prefrontal cortex. It changes the amount of activity in that area. And more importantly, because the brain is a big network and all of those forms of cognition that I mentioned before do rely in part on the prefrontal cortex, they also actually rely on all these interconnected kind of networks that might be the prefrontal cortex and how it connects with the part of the posterior parietal cortex or the temporal lobe, or like all these different kind of brain regions that connect with the PFC. And these functional networks are really what give rise to kind of more complex cognition. So prefrontal cortex is involved, but it's also how it connects with other brain regions is really important. And some of the kind of major takeaways from the research that has been done where they induced heat stress and hyperthermia is that it actually alters both the regional activity level and its connectivity with other parts of the brain. So in part, this is probably because when your body is working really hard to thermoregulate, the thermoregulation regions in your brain are they're in that subcortical area. So cortex on the outside, subcortex, like the inner part of the brain. And like the hypothalamus, for example, is really important for thermoregulation. That is not the prefrontal cortex. Your brain only has so much glucose to metabolize at a given time, so it's thought that it's like your brain doesn't need, your brain's focused on survival, right? Thermoregulate, get that body temperature back into a normal, safe region. And it's sort of at the cost of sort of less essential, higher cognition. So the brain is prioritizing that thermoregulation. And as a consequence, it's almost like there's less kind of resources or bandwidth left for effective functioning of the prefrontal cortex. And when you have these disruptions in activity and functional connectivity between the PFC and other relevant regions, then you just don't think as clearly. You have worsened attention, you have worsened cognitive control. People will make worse decisions. And so I would say the kind of broader thing that you see kind of across these different domains of impulsivity and decision-making is if the brain region that's needed for general cognitive control, decision-making, attention, if that's disrupted, it's going to have downstream effects on kind of a variety of different forms of cognition and impulsivity and decision-making.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And something that we find ourselves in is, one, we could be in a hot ambient environment just from the environment being in the summer. And then we find ourselves in these super heated environments of, we call it IDLH, immediately dangerous to life and health, of being in a house fire. And then we have our own microclimate of being within our gear and how that insulates and increases that uncompensable heat gain. And so we have potentially 3 or more environments all working against us at once. And now we need to make potentially life or death decisions on top of it.
Yes.
So, when we're messing with executive function and, like you said, recall and attention and making meaning out of ambiguous stimuli, like that is a very big deal for us.
Huge deal. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that you brought up like this good point too about like the like layers of it. Cause it's like the extent to which heat is going to have an effect on you is going to differ depending on whether it's just like, uncomfortable ambient temperatures that don't pose a like clear risk. But I mean, the research suggests that even like uncomfortable, but not like harmful conditions can also have these sorts of effects. And it's probably because of a different mechanism. Like there's some evidence to suggest that even absent hyperthermia, just being physically uncomfortable due to the heat stress is distracting. Yeah. And if you're distracted, then you also have a hard time focusing on the task at hand. And so, in addition to like the extreme situation that y'all are in as firefighters, it's also like just I'm sure you're noticing how uncomfortable you are. And that in and of itself is another thing to try to ignore and try to focus on this like rapid task, rapid decision making. And that's going to be a real challenge for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd actually like to get into that next on how to harden ourselves against this. Before we get to that, you reminded me of a couple things with, one, you brought up some great points about connectivity and how all these regions are working off of each other that I hadn't even considered. It makes absolute sense, and we just completely overlooked that. There's some research bodies within the fire service that kind of put together Mayday data when we're in a really bad situation and we're at the point of, at or near death. And one of the layers of that are medical. So half of the deaths in the fire service are cardiac related in the line of duty. And that's some of that is our own fault because we're not as prepared and we're not keeping in good shape. But some of that is the heat stroke and heat exhaustion and heat burden. And then another layer of that is the potential of a diabetic episode. It's way down at the bottom when you look at all of our Mayday data, but it is a component. And something you reminded me of the ATP is, and if you could explain this, the rate at which we burn through our glucose happens much faster. And when that happens, one, we don't have the physical energy, but then we're also kind of reducing some of our cognitive prowess, right? When that starts going down, can you help explain that?
I think you did a pretty good job putting it right like that. Like that's exactly what's going on, right? Your brain needs glucose for effective functioning. And then if all of your energy is going to like the survival processes, like you just don't have it. So, it's like, it's thinking about, you can think about it also, like if you're really hungry, and you haven't eaten in a while and you just feel completely brain dead until you then like have a Snickers, right? Like that's their whole thing, right? It's same thing, basically, right? Like if your brain doesn't have the energy it needs to function properly, it's like you feel intoxicated even, like you just like can't think clearly at all. And so, people haven't looked at like, can you fix heat stress with a Snickers? Probably you can't. But that being the idea, right? Of like, if your brain doesn't have the energy it needs, like good luck.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Just a whole other layer of just the cause and effect there, which is just mind boggling. Now there are some, I guess, are there best practices for adaptation? And I know that I think I'm personally biased from my personal experience, but also my reading with like hard, vigorous workouts, like high intensity workouts, and then also just heat acclimation, whether that be through doing workouts outside and getting used to those temperatures. But even in the wintertime, huge fan of like sauna use. Yeah. So I really enjoy those two. If you could explain, like from what you found in your experience, what are some best practices to help harden ourselves against this uncompensable heat gain? What are, what is the process behind that?
Yeah, so I will admit that I haven't done much of this myself, but I am pretty familiar with the like existing literature that's out there. Yeah. So, as you say, like things like sauna use or heat training, exercise-based heat training, essentially anything you can do that improves the efficacy and speed of your body's thermoregulation response is going to be pretty good. So these sort of like acute exposures, whether it's passive in the case of a sauna or like heat training in an exercise context, what you're doing is you're training your body to respond more quickly when it's undergoing heat stress. And as a consequence, the thermoregulation happens sooner. And so primarily what this means is like you start sweating faster. But because sweating is like the main way that our body cools itself, having that earlier sweat rate is really actually quite effective. I don't know the extent to which kind of other things are that effective. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm not sure whether sauna use and high intensity exercise and the thermoregulation benefits gained are super protective when you get into these uncompensable heat exposures. Like I'm just not, I don't know if the research suggests that is that protective. Then it seems to me it would be, maybe it would delay the onset of like getting to that point or slow the effects of the heat. But it is also the case that no matter how physically fit you are at a certain point, like the heat becomes too much for anyone, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that, no, that's a great differentiation. I appreciate that. If you're already at the point of uncompensable heat gain, you're already past that. I think so that's a great distinction. I think the point would be to, as you said, create as much of a barrier from onset to uncompensable, and that's where those things come into play. So you're just trying to broaden your bucket. You're trying to be more resilient up until that point. And then God forbid if you hit that point, then it's kind of it's run off there.
Yeah, exactly.
Is hydration? Could you speak on that? And I'll just toss you out with this. Like in the fire service, we have long schedules, and we're up at night oftentimes. And I joke that we run off of like caffeine and hate sometimes because we're just mowing through energy drinks and coffee, and we're taking in way too much. And some people try to combat it through just more energy drinks and more coffee and supplement use.
Totally.
And now electrolytes are super huge. Like, I know
it's good
hydration
that you're doing the electrolytes.
Yeah. So if you could just like quickly speak on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like being adequately hydrated is one of the best things you can do, both preventatively, like proactively, and in the moment, if you're experiencing heat stress, because all of as you kind of stated with the dehydration effects, it's a lot of it is like the salt is, it's what you sweat out is a lot of like the essential salts that your muscles need to function appropriately. Like the effects of dehydration are both part of what then causes the major like physical symptoms, but they're also an opportunity for then intervention. So you can prevent some of the like really dangerous effects by being really well hydrated, and in particular electrolyte beverages. Like they're very effective and protective against some of the like clear dangers of heat stress. Not that much has looked at it in like the how does it affect our ability to think, or kind of the psychological side of things. There have been a couple of studies that have proposed that some of heat's negative effects on cognition are due in large parts of dehydration, but it's pretty early days when it comes to kind of understanding the role of dehydration and electrolytes and things like that when it comes to improving cognition or maintaining cognition. But I mean, it's a good practice. And caffeine will dehydrate you. Alcohol will dehydrate you. Even just like drinking only water and you drink a lot of it could also dehydrate you, especially if you're exercising a lot. So I'm not going to tell anyone not to have caffeine. I'm right here. I'm right here with you.
Yeah, right.
But maybe also add some electrolyte beverages in there. I think that's a wise and reasonable step that you can take to protecting yourself.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. Now, switching gears a little bit, and I'll be honest, as I mentioned, I didn't realize that some of the like outdoor nature exposure was something that you dug into, which I love. I know another arm of kind of what I do is supporting mental health and resiliency and durability. And I've talked about some of a book I love is a Japanese doctor talking about Shinrin-yoku of like forest bathing.
Absolutely.
And I just noticed for myself, like I love being outside and hiking and finding those moments. I don't even know what your background is on that. Like if you could just, please educate us on all that, how to support ourselves with that. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the research on nature and mental health, like it's like an overwhelmingly strong body of evidence. Like nature benefits us in so many ways. So like going to this idea of like cognition, for example. So there's so many studies that demonstrate that even like a short walk in nature can restore attention and working memory capacity. One of the like original studies that was done on this by my former advisor, Mark Berman at Chicago, he basically found that a 50-minute nature walk led to a 20% increase in working memory compared to going on an equivalently long urban like city walk, which showed like a little bit of an improvement just because like probably walking's beneficial, but nature had a benefit like above and beyond that of walking. And
that's amazing.
And yeah, it's incredible. Like, so yeah, passive nature exposure. So like that forest bathing, and particularly when it's very immersive, you see kind of the largest effects. Some studies do find effects even with like virtual nature. It's not as profound, right? We think about like a dose response effect where like less immersive and shorter versions of nature are going to have less of a profound effect than like longer, more immersive nature exposure. But in addition to cognition, we see improvements in mood, reductions in stress, so both self-reported and physiological markers, so reduced heart rate, reduced sweating rate, different like other physiological metrics of stress. We just see those things decrease in nature. And I think a lot of people have this kind of lay intuition of like, if you spend some like good quality time in like a really natural place, you can just almost feel like the calm coming over you. And so my research was looking at whether or not the reasons that nature is beneficial for us is just because we like it so much. I was like, is there something actually special or unique or beneficial about nature, or is it just that like if you expose someone to anything they really like, and most people do like nature, do you see equivalent benefits? And the long and short of what I did, which was admittedly it's not all conclusive, right? It's every study has its own limitations, but basically what I found was that for like the mood benefits, it seems to be like nature is beneficial insofar as you like it, and if you expose someone to something they like as much, that you see an equivalent mood benefit. So it might not be anything special about nature per se in that context, but it seems like actually the cognitive benefits might be more to do with nature and not just because we like it. So that was kind of like my research on that. But I mean, beyond that, it's like you see it improvements in physical health. Like it's good for cardiovascular like health and metabolic health, like all kinds of things like that. It's helpful for social behaviors. People act more kindly in natural settings. They're less aggressive in nature. They actually feel more connected to other people and the world around them. Even if there aren't people around, they feel more connected to the world. They're more likely to behave pro-environmentally as well. So nature is one of those things where it's like, it's good for almost everything.
There's no downside.
Like you have a hard time finding an outcome that it doesn't beneficially affect. Though with like the obvious caveat that anytime I talk about nature, I inevitably get somebody that's like, okay, well, what about bears? And I'm like, yeah, okay, obviously bears are not restorative. If you're in Glacier National Park, you come across a bear, you're not going to be like, this is so relaxing. But assuming it's safe, non-threatening,
right.
And like reasonably nice nature, like, yeah, it's like the effects they're profound. And what's cool, I mean, so for me, again, as someone who studies like heat and then also has this history and like nature exposure stuff, I mean, it's also from like a heat mitigation and like adaptation standpoint, urban green space infrastructure is a really cool way to both reduce the effects of something like an urban heat island effect, and also like it offers these additional benefits. So the thinking about green spaces as an intervention to address some of like the climate issues it's amazing because it indirectly affects well-being by reducing the heat, and then it also directly affects well-being because of the way that nature benefits us psychologically and physically. So I'm like very, very pro green space infrastructure.
Yeah, that's really amazing. My family and my wife and I have done a lot of travel to Copenhagen and Denmark, where that is like I'll go as far as saying maybe one of the models for that. Like there is it has to be it's like 80% biking community. It is centered very much around play. Any construction that goes up, and even like working backwards, there has to be a certain amount of green space and play space for anything else to happen. Like they try to manage that well, compared to look at I'll just say some of the East Coast urban areas that I'm used to, where that's not as much of a thing, and you can just it's completely different culturally.
Totally.
And you use the word immersive, and I think from the reading I've done, it makes sense to me. Is it part of that dose response effect you mentioned, where the more in nature you are, the more of a benefit you get? And then even with urban areas, like you're definitely getting a benefit, but it may not be as much as if you are in a national park. Like could you explain that a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, in general, that is true. Essentially, like the more away from the world and in nature and immersed you are, the better it is for you. In part because part of the thinking behind why nature is beneficial is that sense of like really like being away is actually kind of like this crucial part of nature's restoration potential. Is like, if you're away from the rest of your life, you can clear your head, you can get away from it all. And versus if you're in a small urban park, you might not actually feel like you're that away from life, stress, whatever is, on your mind. So on the one hand, it's like that kind of like the immersiveness matters in part because of kind of that being away. It's also, nature is a multi-sensory experience, right? So having just like the visuals of like trees, amazing, great, love it, recommend. But if you still have honking car horns in the background, not as much of a benefit, right? Whereas if you're like in really immersive nature, where it's like you're hearing the bird songs and the rustling leaves and like the wind, like that is, it's visual, it's auditory, and even olfactory. So there's like compounds in the air that are released from like botanical material that also, and that's good for our brains. It also smells good. So like thinking about it as a sort of multi-sensory experience, and kind of the more parts of the sensory experience you can target, the better. At the same time, there's this kind of other way of thinking about it, which is like imagining you're someone who lives in the city and you don't actually have very much access to nature normally. There's pretty good evidence that people that are like the most either they're already psychologically struggling. So there's some research with people with like depression, for example, that benefit more from nature interventions than people without depression. People with areas that have higher socioeconomic disadvantage seem to benefit more from a mental health perspective than higher SES areas. So it seems like if you already are in a place where you need that nature dose for either your well-being or whatever, like even having a city park that might actually lead to an equivalent benefit for that person, just because going from like basically nothing or being in a really depleted state, and then even having a city park could be a huge boost. Whereas like me, I live in Pullman, Washington. I'm basically in the country. Like if I go to a park, it's like, okay, this is just like a slightly more natural space in an already natural area. So even though my park in Pullman might be more immersive than like the park that I used to visit a lot when I lived in Chicago, you can still imagine how like the impact of going to the park might be different for someone who's living in, the city versus someone who's already living somewhere that's a bit more natural and then going to like a slightly more natural space, So that's kind of like the thing that complicates this like dose response relationship, is that the person does matter too. What they're used to seems to matter too.
Yeah, sure. With you having all the, amazing parks and access to nature where you're at, like it's a benefit. But somebody who's coming from like where I'm at next to Baltimore City or Washington, D.C., it's going to be a greater variance there.
Totally.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Is there, we have covered so much ground and and I'm here for it. I have a whole page of notes right now. Is there anything that you really enjoy speaking on, or just with your background, that we've missed, or you think would benefit us in the public safety circle here?
That's a good question. I don't know. I guess I'll just lob out there that I think it's good that the psychological effects of heat are being more investigated now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like historically, they've not really been, and increasingly that is good. But I also I'll highlight that because the research is still sort of new, there's still so much we don't know. And even all of the research I talked about today, this is like what we know, or what we at least think right now based on the available evidence. But there's just like a lot more research needs to be done, and especially in honestly the decision-making domain, because the literature on that is like lots of studies find that acute heat disrupts decision-making. Mm-hmm. And then also there's a lot of studies that like don't actually see that. And so it seems like probably there are a lot of factors that affect it. So like individual differences essentially, and like people's maybe their heat tolerance, maybe their preferences, maybe their tendencies toward acting impulsively to begin with.
Sure.
Some of my recent research is pointing towards like heat might exacerbate impulsivity for already impulsive individuals, and maybe less so for people that aren't already. But that's like new. I haven't published that yet.
Okay. Interesting.
But I want to say like we just like need to do a lot more science on this too, because like we have pretty good evidence that like heat is affecting brain function, heat is affecting cognition a lot of the time, and yet there's still a lot of question marks out there. So It's a cool place to be in from like a research standpoint. It's cool to be in this like new frontier, but there's a lot of work left to do.
Yeah, no, that's really amazing, and I'll certainly keep an eye out for as you get further along in your journey. I would love to hear more about that. It's so neat that what you're doing in Chicago and out on the West Coast has parallels to what we're doing here in the fire service, and I absolutely believe that the information that you gave us, excuse me, will help us kind of harden ourselves and better prepare ourselves when we're in these environments. I'm at a training conference right now, actually in Alexandria at Training Days, and it's a phenomenal conference, and we have a lot of thinkers coming together just talking about all aspects of leadership, but preparedness, and trying to reduce death and injury, but providing an awesome service to the community and the citizens. And some of them are underserved, and some of them are very affluent. But what in the nook of what you're doing, the parallels that we can gain and benefit from are starting to become more well known, and that's been part of my journey, is to try to learn and also get that information out there. So, as I mentioned before, I so appreciate me just throwing a random email out in the out on the web, and you responded and said, "Heck yeah, I'll do it." So it really means a lot, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for this.
Of course.
Yeah. If anybody did happen to have any more questions, like I'll absolutely, once I get this all posted up, I'll definitely link out your research. Is there a preferred contact or anything that you don't mind
email's
sharing?
Good for me.
Email? Yeah. Okay, great.
I'm pretty good about responding to emails. So yeah, people should feel free to email me. Like I said, I think that disseminating the science is like a really like an important part of my job, which is part of why I said yes to this, because if all the research stays in the ivory tower, like what's the point? And especially for something like that has such a clear application, especially in your case. So yeah, if people are interested and want to ask me questions, shoot me an email. I'm happy to.
Awesome.
To respond to any I can. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I think we covered a lot.